College football playoff semifinals are set, and as a blizzard maybe descends upon Texas and Dallas for the Cotton Bowl, we know who will be there, and that's Ohio State against Texas. Texas, the lone SEC team remaining. On the opposite side of the bracket are Notre Dame and Penn State in the Orange Bowl. No snow in the forecast for that game. And no more SEC teams in the field other than the team that just joined the conference less than a year ago. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer, along with John Adams. We'll talk about the teams that are here in these semifinals. But first, a little conversation about the teams who are not. And John, we work in the opinion business. We're at no shortage of them, and many of our colleagues have plenty of opinions as well. And the prevailing thought among the the college football talking heads right now, the pundits, the armchair analysts, is that ding dong, the SEC is dead. Its 20-year rule of college football, great though it was, is over, and the conference is a laughingstock at this point with just one team in the semifinals. Now, I think that's a little extreme. Sometimes there's a tendency to look at things in black and white shades, right? And if the SEC is not dominating, that must mean they're a joke. Well, no, I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. But I do think that there is a strong case to be made that the SEC is not what it once was. So, want to unpack that a little bit with you and see if you agree with that and why we think that might be. So, John, one SEC team in the semifinals is Texas. They're not the favorite. Ohio State's the favorite. What happened to the SEC?
Well, one thing was kind of obvious from the outset, and I thought this was the case with college football in general, though Ohio State has somewhat disproved it by looking like a super team in its two playoff games. But I thought that was what was lacking in the SEC. I've had a run of national champions. Uh, LSU in 2019, Alabama in 20. I think we're two of the all-time greatest college football teams. Then Georgia comes along with defense for the ages and a great clutch quarterback in Stetson Bennett and wins back-to-back national titles, which, as you know, is extremely tough to do in any era. So the SEC's just rolling with all that, and I just think, yeah, it is a overreaction to go from dynasty to dead. Uh, but let's face it, uh, people like people are kind of tired of dynasty. So this is an opportunity for the columnists, for the talk show hosts, for everybody to say, "Ha, dynasty! There's a bunch of deadheads now. That league is done." So it gives you a new theme and something to come out strong on. Uh, we'll see how it goes next year. I thought there were good teams in the SEC, and I overrated the league. I really did. Uh, I second guessed myself for that. Not so much just because of what happened in the playoffs, but now as I look at a full body of work, these teams weren't quite as good as I thought they were. Um, and Tennessee, particular, I thought was overrated. I overrated it. Alabama was not that good. The problem with Alabama, it had too many bad games. And to me, Ole Miss was if I had to pick a team to play Ohio State and Texas from the SEC, I'd take, well, Texas, discount Texas, it's in the SEC, but in terms of talent level, I would put Ole Miss up against Ohio State. I just think because of its talent, I think it has a lot of talent, and it's had some great ups. It's had some really inexplicably bad games, but I just think on its best day, Ole Miss could have probably distinguished itself more in the playoffs than some of these other teams might have.
Yeah, you mentioned, John, still a lot of good teams in this conference. I want to run something by you that I mentioned. I did an appearance on Monday on the Paul Feinbaum show talking about this very topic, the downfall of
Mm-hmm.
the SEC. And as I put it to Paul, about a decade ago, Paul wrote a book called "My Conference is Better Than Your Conference," and he was talking about the SEC in the title of that book. And I said, if that was very true, that undeniably true. Even the SEC naysayers would have had to admit that at that time. I said, if you would write that book though today, the title would be "The Eighth Best Team in My Conference is Better Than the Eighth Best Team in Your Conference." And that's sort of the way I look at the SEC right now. Like, there's a lot of people going into the playoff that were defending the SEC, saying this league's so tough, they needed more teams in. Look at the strength of schedule, blah blah blah. But tournaments like this, 12-team tournaments, playoffs that feature the best 12 teams, it's not a contest of which conference has the best eighth best team. If it was a conference, if it was a contest of which conference had the best eighth best team, I think the SEC would win. I mean, you look at a bowl game like LSU beating Baylor in the postseason. Bowl games don't matter that much. You got opt outs. It's kind of a bad comparison. But the point being, I think a team like an LSU, like Florida at the end of the season, even other middle of the pack teams in the conference, say a Mizzou. I think the eighth best team in the SEC is still better than teams of that level in other conferences. But again, that's not what the playoff is. And for 20 years, the SEC didn't just have the eighth best team in the conference, they had the best teams in the land. And I don't think that's kept pace. Like, they're not pulling away from the pack like they used to. They're not stockpiling all the best talent like they used to. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. One, there's no Nick Saban. For 20 years, there was a 20-year span, John, from 2003 to 2023, in which the SEC produced, or I guess through 2022, excuse me, from the 2003 season through the 2022 season, the SEC produced 14 of the 20 national champions during that span. Saban, though, produced 7. So half of the 14 titles that the SEC won, Saban was responsible for. So that's one factor. But I think the larger factor is the introduction of NIL and the freedom of transfer acquisition that moved into college football in 2021. And when that happened, I asked Nick Saban at the time for his thoughts on this, on NIL and transfer acquisition and how that would affect the sport. And Saban mused aloud. He said, "Is it going to make the rich get richer?" Now, he didn't answer his own question, but he seemed to be implying that the rich would get richer. Well, Nick Saban was right about a lot in his career, but I think he was wrong about this. I don't think the rich got richer. In fact, I think the rich have come back to the pack a little bit, but the middle class moved into the upper middle class. Their ability to buy players and take, not the best players off Alabama and Georgia and Ohio State, but the guy who would have been the second string quarterback at Georgia 5 years ago is now the starting quarterback somewhere else, making that team better. And so I think it raised the middle class, and it prevented the number of juggernauts that could just stockpile all the best players. And I think there is a little bit of a leveling of the playing field, at least at the top.
Yeah, I agree with that. Agree with you on that. Here's the thing: we lump the two together, NIL
Mm-hmm.
and transfer portal. I think the NIL enhanced the SEC's dynasty possibilities because I think the SEC schools, they care the most about football. So they're going to spend the most. And we see that happening now, where the SEC is recruiting really well. It's doing really well in the portal. But the point you make, that's the difference, I think, in super teams and good teams. I can go back and look at Alabama's best teams, its national champions, and remember watching games when a regular season game, when the game was totally out of hand, Alabama was in command. You come in the fourth quarter, and you notice this 6'4", 240-pound linebacker creating mayhem in the backfield of the opposing team. And you think about that guy and you say, yeah, he's waiting his turn, but he's a freshman now, but a couple of years, he's going to be one of these all SEC linebackers, one of these first round draft picks. I can remember when Derrick Henry was a backup runner at Alabama and came in the games in the fourth quarter, reeled off an 80-yard touchdown run one time. That kind of depth, I don't think you'll ever see again. It could be in a flukish sense where it could happen occasionally, but that became routine. And I'm using Alabama as an example because you pointed out it was very much the marquee team in the SEC's dynasty. So you look at that team and you see when it can bring a fourth-string running back off the bench, and he weighs almost 250 pounds and can outrun anybody in the secondary. You're just not going to see that anymore. And that takes when you go through a course of a season and you've got 4 elite running backs or 4 or 5 elite wide receivers, it shows up more anytime somebody sprains an ankle or pulls a hamstring and you got to go to your bench. Those Alabama teams weren't fazed by it. And neither, and there have been some other teams like that. So, yeah, it's a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's not that like say Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, these type of programs aren't getting elite players. They are. It's just that the guy who was content to be a backup at Alabama before, because there was no better deal for them before. There was nobody, at least above the table anyway. There was no donor above the table at another program that could say, why do you want to be the backup at Alabama when we would pay you to be our starter here? You not only you get playing time, but you might get a sweeter deal from another school to transfer and be their starter than you would get to be the backup at an Alabama. And I think what you were saying, John, is like NIL is not a death blow to the SEC because, all these programs in the SEC, they care very much about football. Their fans care very much about football. They'll invest. And yet, nonetheless, it doesn't mean that the backup at Alabama would make more than, say, they're willing to pay to be the starter somewhere else. Like these other programs have some money too, right? And so, you could still get a better deal to be the starter elsewhere. And I think that sort of weakens, what we're talking about here, the ability to stockpile the most talent. And I mean, NIL is not open books here, John, but I haven't heard anybody raise their hand and say that they outspent Ohio State. Ohio State's athletic director, Ross Bjork, disclosed that Ohio State spent $20 million in NIL funds on this roster. That's believed to be the biggest NIL investment for a team this season. And so as much as the SEC teams care and invest toward football, I haven't heard any whisperings or anecdotes about someone outspending Ohio State's $20 million. And lo and behold, Ohio State has the most talented team. It's why we were all confused why Ohio State could manage to lose to Michigan in the first place. Like, we know Ryan Day's history against Michigan, but with this team against that Michigan team, which was flawed and had no quarterback, how did this team with this much Ohio State talent lose to Michigan? Well, we still don't really know the answer to that, but we do know that Ohio State is finally getting what it paid for. It is playing like the team that it bought. And you look at who's left from the SEC, Texas, but Texas is no pauper either. Like, to some extent, you get what you pay for. And Ohio State and to a certain extent Texas, I think got what they paid for. But I just think like it's programs like Illinois and Minnesota and Ole Miss and South Carolina and Mizzou. I think they raised a little bit. They got a little bit better in the last few years because of NIL, because of transfers. They could take players from other programs, and it's at the expense of programs like Alabama and Georgia. So it's not just that like the entire SEC is worse off than it was 5 years ago. I think the top end of the SEC is worse off than it was 5 years ago. I think programs like Ole Miss, Mizzou, and South Carolina are much better off than they were 5 years ago. So it's not just that like other schools from other conferences are able to pull away from the SEC, but you're kind of pulling away from yourselves too. And, Georgia's backup quarterback is now quite literally the starter at Kentucky. Whereas 5 years ago, he might have still been the backup quarterback at Georgia, and he might have been playing against Notre Dame in a college football playoff game.
Yes, it certainly affected the depth, and one of the things I think we're losing somewhat. The goal of almost anybody who excelled in high school football seemed to be, I'm going to make it in the NFL. That was the ultimate goal. That was your payday. That was the pinnacle of the sport. So all these guys aspired to become that, even though the odds were drastically against them. But a program like Alabama, with a coach like Nick Saban, could tell you, he didn't have to tell you. He could just point to his track record and say, here's who I put in the NFL. This is where you want to go. I know how to get you there. And that to me was the ultimate motivation for so many players going into college football, was to make it to the NFL. That was their payday. Now they're getting their payday out of high school. They're getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions, to go play in college. They've had their payday. So I think, and when you think about it, $500,000 to someone coming out of high school or someone just a couple of years into college seems almost, a lifetime's worth of money. Almost, it's more money than they've ever thought of making, and it's all right there. So I wonder, when you're trying to sell that player on going to Alabama and playing for Nick Saban, he'll get you to the pros. You're already a pro. So
And Nick
maybe
Saban's not
just
coaching anymore.
maybe the player would just as soon go to Minnesota and make more money than he could maybe at Alabama, and have a pro-like coach, a coach with a reputation in developing players for the NFL. And other coaches have done that too. I'm not just singling out Nick Saban. I just don't know that matters much. I think right now, the immediate gratification of getting a payday in college overrides almost everything else. And I don't know if it's always in the player's best interest. I think a lot of times it isn't. But that's the motivation. And so maybe Minnesota can't match Georgia's NIL fund, but maybe it can match it for 3 or 4 players.
Bingo.
It may match it for 15, but it can match it for 3 or 4.
And that's so key, John. That hits it. It's not just like total dollars that you got. You might win the war, but lose a few battles that you would have won 5 years ago when this wasn't part of the sport. And by the way, and I think you're the same way, John. I don't want to speak for you, but like I much prefer this in terms of like players being compensated than I would dial back the clock to a time when players weren't. Like it's meant that the SEC is not ruling right now. I don't think that means that they forever will be down and out. We know how much these programs care about college football, and when you don't win, sometimes that's the biggest motivator, right? When you're Ohio State and haven't won a national championship in a decade, next thing you know, you got a $20 million roster. When you're Oregon and you're trying to go from being the nouveau riche to being a national championship program, and you got Mr. Nike behind you, you got a well compensated roster. I think being down and not tasting success on the same level at some of these places could be very motivating. It could be very infuriating too, but these SEC programs aren't going to accept losing. Well, might be some heads roll next year, but the money's not going to stop flowing in. I don't think all of a sudden Southerners are going to say, you know what, we don't care about football anymore. There's some momentum going on in basketball. We're done donating toward football. No, you fire the coach and you get behind the new one, both in terms of your support and the dollars. So maybe Texas wins the whole thing this year and the SEC gets the last laugh. But even if it doesn't, I have a hard time believing that the SEC is going to be quote unquote down forever.
Blake, I look at this as a transitional time in college football because of the NIL and transfer portal. And I think programs are still trying to figure this out. I think they're still trying to figure out how to build a roster. And I think eventually everybody will figure it out. I mean, you'll need to get more info and more data, and you'll see how it evolves. But once that happens, I think the SEC will be at the top because, as you mentioned, it's willing to spend money and it's driven. It means more. Winning football games means more in the Southeastern Conference than it does anywhere else. And there are teams that are exceptions, but as an overall conference, it means so much, and that will be a driving force. So once it's all figured out, once you get the blueprint of how many quality control coaches do we need on the sideline, how many guys do we need in our quote personnel department? How do we manage it? What's the best way to go about this? What's the formula? I think eventually you'll have that. And I think then that's when the SEC will once more be the premier conference. It's still a premier conference, but as you say, you're talking about an eighth place team. In the olden days, not that long ago, there was no question. When the SEC won 7 consecutive national titles, no, I mean there was no arguing. When the SEC leads all the recruiting services in the top 25, when the SEC puts more players in the NFL, there's just no measuring stick that didn't prove to us that the SEC was the best conference. And that included, of course, hoisting that trophy at the end of the season.
Mm-hmm.
And SEC didn't hoist it last year, and it might not this year. But long term, I think it'll still be fine.
Yeah, I agree with you with a caveat, John. I do think the SEC is going to come roaring back. I don't know how easy it will be to have another 20-year stretch like that 20-year run where the SEC produced 14 national champions in a 20-year stretch. More to the point, I think it'll be very, very difficult for one program, Alabama, to win 6 national titles in, well, I guess it was less than 20 years that Alabama did it because I'm expanding that 20 years out to include Georgia's titles. So if you dial it back a little bit, Alabama won 6 in fewer than 20 years. I think it'll be harder for one team, one brand inside the SEC or out to go on a run like that. I don't know if we'll ever see a run again like what we saw from Nick Saban in Alabama, but the SEC is going to come roaring back. If you put this in stock market terms, they always say buy low, sell high, right? Like now is the time to get back in on the SEC. You want to buy low. It's taking a tumble. You buy low because this is a solid blue chip performing stock that pays a nice dividend, and you're getting it at a good price right now. One program I also wonder, John, if you could get a good price on in stock market terms at this moment. What's going on at Georgia? Like, the apologists will say, yeah, well, this Georgia loss doesn't really count because Carson Beck was out playing with a backup quarterback, making his first career start, Gunnar Stockton. That's true. And yet I believe, John, based on what we saw in the Sugar Bowl and what we saw this season while Carson Beck was playing, I think Georgia probably would have lost that game even with Carson Beck. It's not like Carson Beck had a great season. He was very up and down. And as we recall, Georgia was losing at halftime in the SEC championship game when Carson Beck got injured, and it was Gunnar Stockton who rallied the team to victory. Gunnar Stockton made some mistakes. That strip sack before halftime, which he fumbled, set up Notre Dame for a touchdown, was catastrophic. I put that more on Kirby Smart, as much at least, than I do on Gunnar Stockton. I think Kirby Smart should have gone to halftime in that situation. 39 seconds left. Yeah, you're down 3 points, but you got a guy making his first career start. You're playing an awesome defense, 39 seconds on the clock. Just go to halftime, regroup, say we outplayed Notre Dame for the first half, trailing on the scoreboard, but like what we're seeing, can beat him in the second half. No, he forced the issue, strip sack, and it was all over from there. But when you look forward, John, so Carson Beck's headed for the NFL. Jaden Rashada, the once ballyhooed recruit with all the NIL drama surrounding him, well, he transferred to Georgia before this season. He's back in the transfer portal. Gunnar Stockton, I guess, could be the quarterback next season, but based on what we saw against Notre Dame, he was fine. But do you think Gunnar Stockton's going to be hoisting the national championship trophy next year? I have some questions about that. And Georgia recruiting, I mean, they signed the number 3 in the nation recruiting class this year. Pretty good, right? But they're not recruiting at the level, and I think this goes to our point earlier where like other people have money too. They're not recruiting at the level that Kirby was a few years ago when he was just on this absolute recruiting heater, and it was like Georgia and Alabama on the recruiting circuit, and there was a separate category for everybody else. Like Texas is recruiting incredibly well. Alabama is still recruiting well. Ohio State, Oregon, Auburn, like Georgia's kind of more recruiting in their mix than running away with the recruiting trophy. And so Georgia's not going to fall off the map, John. But the way I look at it is like their dynasty, in like the true sense of the dynasty word, their little mini dynasty they had for about like 3 seasons, won 2 national championships, was still one of the best teams in the country last year, had the misfortune of losing the SEC championship game, and so didn't make a 14 playoff. But that little mini dynasty, I think it's on the ropes, if not over, and still going to be a very good program. Might be a playoff program next year, but I think there's an opportunity here for others in the SEC to rise up because, at least by the standards of the last few years, I think Georgia's headed for a little bit of a murky future next season.
Oh, I agree with you. I'm not sure Georgia can finish in the top 3 of the SEC next season. It will again have a difficult schedule. And I look at teams like Texas, LSU, even Texas A&M. I expect Texas A&M to be really good next year. Of course, I've only been wrong about Texas A&M 20, 25 times, but once more, I will put myself out on that limb. I think here's a problem you have when you are, you have to constantly be changing, more so than ever now. You can't ever, what worked 2 years ago may not work now. And I think that's hard for coaches to do when they're successful, is to make those subtle changes, or even less than subtle, more than subtle changes. For example, what's worked for Georgia? Okay, it's been very successful. But you look at this Georgia receiving core, and this was magnified by having a backup quarterback, certainly. Yeah, Carson Beck had an up and down season, but as a pure passer and somebody to threaten the defense throwing the ball, he's superior to Gunnar Stockton. What good did it do him with those receivers? I mean, they're dropping the ball all over the place. This wasn't an average receiving core. It was a bad receiving core. I mean, this should be a lower, this is in the SEC, this should be a lower echelon receiving core. It wasn't a typical SEC receiving core. I think it's so important now when you evaluate your roster and you start to think, how am I going to divvy up my NIL money? Well, I know I got this player, these players coming back, they're experienced, they know the system. Fine. But can you get somebody better? And I think that's how coaches have to think now, that, yeah, this guy knows my system. He's been pretty productive. He's gotten better from year 1 to year 2. I think he'll get better in year 3. However, can I go over here and get this player who's already putting up big numbers somewhere else, give him the NIL money that I might have paid this returning starter? And it's a real balancing act, because you bring in somebody and pay them more than what the veterans on the team are already making. Team chemistry issues arise. I'm not sure how you go about that, but I do think you have to really take a hard look at your roster and at your depth chart, and you can't weigh it too much based on your past experience. You can't fall in love with those veterans on your depth chart. If you think you can get somebody better, it's a pro sport now. Go get them.
Yeah, Georgia's doing nothing in the transfer market right now. I mean, maybe that changes, but a lot of the a lot of top talent's already been snapped up. Georgia's doing nothing. The only team doing less in the SEC than Georgia in the transfer market is Tennessee, and I have no idea what the hell Tennessee's doing in its offseason. This has been a disaster of an offseason for the Vols, and so there you have two of the three teams that made the playoff from the SEC this year, Georgia and Tennessee. I don't like the way Tennessee's offseason is going at all. Georgia at least still signed a top 3 recruiting class, but that means it's doing nothing in the transfer market. And then you got schools like LSU, Ole Miss, Auburn are tearing it up in the hot stove league on the transfer circuit. I mean, those 3 teams I think are on the rise, and Ole Miss was knocking at the door of the playoff this year. Now they have to replace Jackson Dart. That's not insignificant for Ole Miss, but I still think Ole Miss will be right there next year with what they're doing in the transfer circuit. Brian Kelly, all of a sudden, to his credit, I guess, has realized like in the year 2025, can't ignore transfers, Brian. He was kind of out on transfers before this season, made some interesting comments about being a little lukewarm on this whole portal player type of thing. Well, they've gone pretty well all in on the portal this offseason, and they're going to have a veteran quarterback, Garrett Nussmeier, coming back. So you add a proven quarterback with all the transfer talent coming in. You better get your jokes in on Brian Kelly right now. I mean, it's very in vogue, and we've taken a look at Brian Kelly and what happened this season ourselves on this podcast. But with Notre Dame being in the semifinals, is very in vogue to mock Brian Kelly right in this moment, and fair, right? I mean, I think Brian Kelly opened himself up for that by leaving Notre Dame, implying that he left because he's got a better chance to win a national championship at LSU. And here it is. Notre Dame's in the semifinals, and Brian Kelly hasn't made the playoff yet with LSU. But let's not write the coaching obituary yet for Brian Kelly and LSU, because he's smashing it on the transfer circuit. And I mean, I cast plenty of criticism in Hugh Freeze's direction this season, John, and I will stand by all that. I think Hugh Freeze made a mess of this season. However, he signed a very good high school recruiting class, and he's following it up with a very good performance on the transfer circuit. And so you look at those teams, feel like are, LSU, Auburn could be on the rise. Ole Miss, maybe he's not going to lose a step. And then you look at other programs like Tennessee and Georgia, and it's like, what are you guys doing?
Well, I think you bring up Hugh Freeze. I think it's interesting. One of the most important things in this era now is, can you keep the big boosters, the big money people, your NIL investors? Can you keep their confidence? Well, Hugh Freeze, I believe, has done that. I'm not sure Brent Venables has done that at Oklahoma, but Hugh Freeze has done that. You can measure faith, confidence, belief via the transfer portal, because that reflects on NIL money. Auburn is pouring money into this program, which tells me it still believes in Hugh Freeze. Once you lose that, you're done. And Auburn hadn't lost that. I think right now, if Alabama and Auburn were playing, when I look ahead to that game next year, all the way at the end of the year, nothing like looking ahead. Right now, based on what I've seen, I'd pick Auburn to win that game.
Yeah, my concern with Auburn is, and you might be more of a believer than I am. I'm not totally out, but I am concerned about Jackson Arnold, the quarterback that is probably first in line to be the starter for Auburn next year. The transfer from Oklahoma, is he the guy that we thought he was going to be on the recruiting circuit? I mean, it didn't pan out for him at Oklahoma. It wasn't all his fault. And yet he was in that program for a couple of years, never really ignited for him there. Certainly didn't this season. Wide receiver injuries, offensive line was a mess. Will he be a different player at Auburn? Maybe. But that's a question I still have about Auburn. There's more mystery at the very least around its quarterback position than, say, LSU, where Garrett Nussmeier wasn't maybe the best quarterback in the conference this year. That honor may have gone to Jackson Dart although Nussmeier won the head-to-head, didn't have a great game, but pulled it out in the head-to-head. But I mean, Nussmeier is going to come into next season as one of the best quarterbacks in college football. He's proven that. Guy's got a ton of talent. I think he's going to have even more talent around him next year. And so that's maybe where I question Auburn a little bit is how's the quarterback going to look? Is Jackson Arnold going to be able to reboot and be the quarterback we thought he was at one time that it didn't pan out at Oklahoma? I know what Garrett Nussmeier is, I feel like, at this point, and I feel like he's pretty darn good.
Well, I think with Jackson Arnold, maybe why I'm higher on him than you, I think I watched him pass for 361 yards in a bowl game. He also threw 4 interceptions. That was after his freshman year. He wasn't the starter. He was behind Dillon Gabriel. Dillon Gabriel transfers to Oregon. He comes in. But just the way he threw the ball, his release, his accuracy, when he was at his best, when he was cooking. And then I watched him rush for over 100 yards on Alabama's defense this past season. He's got the skill set, I think, to be really good. And now you're going to surround him with an experienced offensive line and possibly elite receiving corps. And I just think he's going to be better. Would you rather just look at it from quarterback perspective? Since I brought up Alabama, who would you rather have as your quarterback going into next season? What Alabama has or what Auburn has?
Can I pick what LSU has?
No,
Can I pick what Florida? Can I pick what Florida has? Can I pick what South Carolina has?
No, you can't.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess if those are the only two options, maybe as it stands today here on January 6th, I might lean Auburn, but I'd rather have Garrett Nussmeier, DJ
Well, you can't
Lagway.
have it, Blake.
Oh,
You
okay.
can't
Oh,
have it.
okay. Okay. All right. Well, we got that clear. John, we're going to get into our picks here in a moment, but I want to spend a few minutes on Texas, being as they are the only SEC team still in the playoff. I feel like with the other 3 teams in the semifinals, I kind of know what they are at this point. Like Penn State, Notre Dame, I got a pretty good feel for what those teams are. They're solid teams that are really strong on defense. Got pretty good offensive lines. They do just enough offensively. They usually win the turnover battle, ball control. A little bit different. I mean, Riley Leonard, for Notre Dame, can beat you with his legs a little bit, leaves something to be desired in the passing game, particularly when Notre Dame goes up against the best competition. Penn State, I feel like they have a little bit more higher ceiling in the passing game. Not great, but I think it's a little higher ceiling than Notre Dame. Love the tight end at Penn State, Warren. I think Drew Aller has some really good abilities. But so I feel like I know what those teams are. Ohio State, I think I know what it is too. The Michigan game was an aberration. Can't explain that other than Ryan Day turtles up when he sees Michigan, and so does the whole program. But whatever, Michigan's not in this playoff, and Ohio State's a monster. They've got the most talent. They're loaded at every position. They're better than anyone in the country at wide receiver, which has become one of the most important positions in college football throughout the last decade. I feel like I know what those 3 teams are. Texas, I still don't know if I totally know. I mean, at times, I feel like Texas has looked like the best team in the country. At other times, I thought, like, is this even a top 25 team? And that could change from quarter to quarter, or half to half. You look what they did against Arizona State, in the first couple quarters of that game, it's like, okay, this is going to be a blowout without much drama. Texas has a tendency to play with its food a little bit, and it blew that SEC championship game against Georgia, almost blew this playoff game in the quarterfinals against Arizona State. So I don't know. I still think Texas is really talented, has the depth chart to contend for a national championship, but why can't they put it all together for 4 quarters? And can Quinn Ewers go out and be the guy? Can he go for the throat? Not let his foot off the gas? Because I don't think they're changing to Arch Manning at this point. Whether they should or they shouldn't, I don't think it's happening.
Well, it's funny you asked that about Texas, and you're in a quandary as to just the uncertainty of how good is Texas. I'm the same way in that I think Texas has a comparable roster maybe to Ohio State, talent-wise. I mean, it's had some injuries, lost some key players, but it's hard for me to look at Texas and think Ohio State could go out and do to Texas what it did to Tennessee and Oregon. I just think there are too many good players at too many different positions. I look at Texas and think it hasn't played its best game. That that we haven't. You could have said the same thing about Ohio State going into the playoffs. We didn't see Ohio State as this a juggernaut above all others. It lost to Oregon. It lost to Michigan. It barely beat Nebraska. And now we see a superpower in Ohio State. I'm wondering if Texas has that kind of potential. If it has that ability to really to rise up and play its very best game in the playoff. And so that's maybe it doesn't. Maybe this is just who it is. But over the last few years, couple of years, I mean, I've seen Texas play exceptional games. And I noticed that Steve Sarkisian talked about how what a talented team Ohio State is. Now, all coaches, it used to be in olden days, they used to say that more often. They prop up the other team. And the old rat poison, as Nick Saban just started a couple of years ago. But I don't think he was saying that for any other reason than for his team, because his team has been hearing since the start of the season. I mean, it was ranked right there near the top in preseason. It's coming off a playoff season, and everybody's saying, Urban Meyer said last year, Texas has the best roster in college football. So these guys have always heard how good they are, and now they're hearing from their own coach, yeah, you're a good team, but Ohio State, that's the team. And I think that was his message to them. You're now playing an elite team. You think you're elite? Well, you have to prove it. And so I think that's Texas's challenge in the semifinals.
I agree with you that Texas is in the same vicinity of Ohio State in terms of talent. The difference I see is um, Texas has some good wide receivers. Ohio State has great wide receivers. There's nobody on Texas like Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, and frankly, I'd probably take Emeka Ibuka, the Ohio State veteran receiver that seems like he's been there a lifetime now, and has been surpassed in terms of the spotlight and also in terms of yardage by Jeremiah Smith, the Bollywood 19-year-old. But I'd take Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Ibuka before I'd take any Texas wide receivers. And Ohio State's backfield, that one-two punch of Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. Texas has had some injuries in the backfield, and to their credit, the guys that they've had to rely on have stepped up and gotten the job done to the best that they can. But you can't match that 1-2 backfield punch. Penn State can. Penn State has a 1-2 backfield punch that can match Ohio State. But yeah, I like Texas' talent as well, particularly on the offensive line, defensive line, really every level of defense. I like Texas, but I do think at those skill positions, I think Ohio State's great at wide receiver. Nobody's as good as them at wide receiver, and I think at running back, Ohio State is better than Texas as well.
Which quarterback do you trust more?
Mm. At this point, maybe Will Howard. And maybe that's a reflection, but it's hard to separate, right? Because what would Quinn Ewers look like? It's funny because Quinn Ewers used to be at Ohio State, right? But and I'm not saying I think you're interpreting me correctly, John. But I'm not saying Texas doesn't have talent at the skill positions. They do, but Ohio State's better at the skill positions.
Oh
So
yeah.
what would Quinn Ewers look like throwing to Jeremiah Smith? I don't know, but like right now, just what we've seen, not just what we've seen the past couple of weeks, but evaluating the totality of the season. Will Howard was awful against Michigan. The whole team was awful against Michigan. But overall, I think I'd take Will Howard over Quinn Ewers. You?
Yeah, I probably would too. I guess for me to see a path to victory for Texas, you just mentioned it. it has the line on both sides of the ball to match up with Ohio State. It's
Hmm.
not going to be overmatched in those areas as most teams are. I mean, it's top of the line, offense and defensive line. And everybody's bunged up. I realize that, but I think when you get in a game like this and you see how one-sided those Ohio State's other playoff games were, it was granted super skilled players, but they were whipping people physically on both sides of the ball. It wasn't even close.
Totally
Uh,
agree. Totally agree. All right, let's
and,
pick these two. Let's pick these two semifinals, John. And boy, we are in a dead heat coming around the final turn. You were one game down last week. Well, you made up that game, and now we are deadlocked in the standings. Both terrible in the standings, but tied nonetheless. We're both 42 and 48 for the season against the spread. If this were putting real dollars behind it, we'd be broke, but I'm not putting real dollars behind it. As far as I know, you're not either, John. So all we're
not a
going
penny.
all we're going for here is pride. 3 games left in the season. Who can win the coveted crown in our picks contest? All right, we got 2 to pick. I'm gonna have you pick the Orange Bowl first. I'll follow with my pick, and then I will pick the Cotton Bowl first. So the line in the Orange Bowl between Notre Dame and Penn State. Notre Dame, a 2.5-point favorite. Perhaps the sports books have James Franklin's history in big games in mind as they set this line, or maybe the books just loved what Notre Dame did in the past, in the final 2 quarters plus the final, I guess, 39 seconds or minute of the second quarter against Georgia. So Notre Dame 2.5-point favorite. Who you taking?
Well, if Ohio State hadn't been playing hadn't been playing in such a dominant fashion, I would have probably taken note of Notre Dame above all else. I think the way it played against Georgia and in its first round game, it was very dominant. And get back, we're talking line of scrimmage again. Notre Dame can excel there, even with the depleted defensive line. Um, Boy, this game is so hard to pick, though. I mean, I look at the positions, I look at the quarterbacks. Um,
It's like looking at a mirror, isn't it? I mean, these teams really resemble each other a lot. I think.
yeah, and I think I'm getting 2.5 points with Penn State,
Hmm.
so I'll take that. To me, this is like an even game, so I'll take Penn State.
I'm taking Penn State too. Really, for the last few years, I feel like I've been high on Penn State, and it's finally been vindicated to a certain extent this year. They lost their 2 biggest games to Ohio State and Oregon, but they didn't lose by that much. They were competitive, and they're not playing Ohio State or Oregon in this game. They're playing Notre Dame. I think these teams are very, very similar. I just think Penn State's got just a bit more punch on offense. I love their tight end, Tyler Warren. You can do anything with him. Um, I like Drew Aller as a passer a little bit more than I like Riley Leonard. And I love that Penn State defense. I know now this is big. Abdul Carter, their stud on defense, is what I guess in NFL terms you would call questionable with an arm injury. If he plays, that makes a huge difference for that defense. But I mean, there's studs everywhere on Penn State's defense. I mean, Penn State, really all 4 defenses left in this playoff are legit. The linebacker Kobe King is excellent. So yeah, I think it'll be what we expect, a kind of a brass knuckle fight. But I just trust Penn State on offense a little bit more. And I know James Franklin's history in big games. Wouldn't have, not necessarily going to pick him for the national championship if they get there. But I not only like the points, I would pick Penn State outright in this game. So we're matched up there. We'll see if we go in different directions on this one, or does our contest come down to the national championship game? The Cotton Bowl, a game I'm supposed to be covering, John, if the weather will allow me to get there. Ohio State, a 5.5-point favorite. I'm all in on the Buckeyes. I was all in on the Buckeyes in the preseason. I thought they were the nation's best team. I wavered, not after the Oregon game. I didn't really waver after the Oregon game. They lost by 1 point on the road. that didn't give me pause. Didn't even really waver after the Nebraska game because everybody's allowed one clunker, I think. The Michigan game gave me some pause, but my faith in Ohio State is restored. They say Ryan Day can't win the big one. Well, guess what? Somebody's going to win their first national championship this season as a coach. Nobody left in this field has won a title. So somebody's got to do it for the first time. I think Ohio State's got the best team. I don't think it'll be a total blowout. To your point, I think it's going to be more competitive than Ohio State's games against Tennessee and Oregon, but I will give the 5.5 points and take the Buckeyes.
Well, I guess I'm kind of a dreamer here.
Oh, boy.
I still think I don't have a lot of confidence in Texas because when I watched them play, and I don't have as much confidence in Quinn Ewers. Like I just said, I would take Will Howard over him right now. But we're not talking, we're kind of talking apples and oranges when you look at those receiving cores. Gosh, I still think Texas has a great game in it. And I go back to watching Texas dismantle Florida during the regular season. I mean, Florida's a mediocre team, but it played a lot of good teams tough. It was just overwhelmed by Texas. And the other way I look at this, and the reason I'm willing to take Texas and those points, I wouldn't take this Texas straight up, but with the points, is Ohio State has played at such a high level, back-to-back games. I really don't know if you can do that 3 straight games. So
you're operating under the theory that we've seen the best from Ohio State, and they may not be able to replicate the best, and we haven't seen Texas's best fastball yet.
Yes.
All right. Well, we can knock the SEC, but you can't take the SEC out of John. He's rolling with the SEC team in his picks.
I'm a pure Southerner, boy.
There you go. There you go.
Them on the field.
And
you
you've
can't
welcomed
beat that out of me, boy.
Yeah, you've welcomed with open arms this SEC newcomer. And we'll be back with you to discuss these semifinal games and get ready for the national championship next week. Enjoy the semifinals. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.